Hello everyone and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalists episode 59. Today I'm going to talk about China. I've already done 2 episodes on China, one dealing with China during the Maoist years, and then secondly on the rise of China. But I've been sent a message. I received it a few days ago. I listened to 3 of your podcasts today, both part 1 and 2 on China and the Anita one. I was very into the China ones. It's so hard to learn about modern China and make sense of it. Making sense of things that don't make sense is definitely a gift of yours. Thank you very much. The explanation around the Reds and experts helped to tie everything together. I think that it would be good for you to do another on the Opium Wars, British rule of Hong Kong, so that it sets the tone for what the 100 years before 1949 actually meant for China. And I thought, well, that's actually a good idea. So I had been thinking along these lines, but I hadn't actually put anything together. So now I am putting things together. So basically this is going to be a very short trip through Chinese history. And then we're going to concentrate on China from basically the Opium Wars. So we'll start with the beginning of Chinese history, with the formation of the Shang civilization. So the Shang civilization existed about 1700 BC, so that's nearly 3,000 years ago. So China is the oldest continuous civilization. All of the civilizations that came after the Shang acknowledged that they were the ancestors of the present civilization, whichever it happened to be. And this history occurs to the same people. It occurs to the Qin, what we call the Chinese. And unlike in Europe, where you get a lot of population movement, in China, the population, while there are lots of people moving about, the people tend to stay the same. They're still the same ethnic group. Even though in China, there are many different ethnic minorities. There are probably as many ethnic minorities in China as there are in Europe. There are many different ethnicities and nationalities. But the thing that unifies them is not just the government, but the written language, because Chinese can be taught to people who don't speak Chinese and they don't know the language at all. And then you can still communicate through the written language. Now, China has a very long and very complex history. I'm just going to give you the very big highlights. So China does not become a unified country until 221 BC. And then 1400 years later, in 1271, the Mongols conquer China and set up the Yuan dynasty. And the very first Mongol emperor to conquer China said that the Mongols would eventually be conquered by the Chinese, as in, even though they were in charge, eventually they'd become culturally Chinese. And that's exactly what happened. And then in 1368, there was a rebellion, and the Ming dynasty came into power. And they were an indigenous Chinese dynasty. And you've probably heard of Ming vases. The Ming are quite famous. And the Ming dynasty was a golden age in China. It was probably the time when they were most engaged with the world. And as I said, it was the height of Chinese civilization. But even the golden age ends. And in 1644, the Manchu invaded China. Now, the Manchu were very much like the Mongols, except they come from Manchuria, which is the area of China north of Korea and east of Mongolia. And they actually got through the Great Wall. They came around the side. They basically breached the wall right at the coastline, and then they invaded China and successfully conquered it. And until 1911, when China becomes a republic, China is ruled by the Manchu. And just like the Yuan dynasty, who were Mongolian, the Manchu culturally became Chinese. But the Chinese people knew that these people really weren't Chinese. So you get this, in the 1800s, you get this anti-imperial rule or movements, and a lot of it is nationalist, saying, hey, we're Chinese, we should be ruled by Chinese people, but we're being ruled by foreigners. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. Now, the thing that really brings China into the modern world is the Opium Wars. So opium has been cultivated since the Stone Age. We don't actually know exactly how long it has been cultivated, but it's been used in food, it's used as an anesthetic, and it was used for ritual purposes. And until the 1400s, we don't actually have any evidence that it was used for recreation. It may have been, but we don't have any evidence for it. The earliest clear description of the use of opium as a recreational drug in China comes from Zhu Biling, who wrote in 1483 that opium was mainly used to aid masculinity, strengthen sperm, and regain vigour, and that it enhances the art of alchemists, sex, and court ladies. And it was regarded in China as an aphrodisiac, amongst other things. Opium smoking began as a privilege of the elite and remained a great luxury into the early 19th century. However, by 1861, Wang Tao wrote that opium was used even by rich peasants, and even a small village without a rice store would have a shop where opium was sold. Smoking of opium came on the heels of tobacco smoking and may have been encouraged by a brief ban on the smoking of tobacco by the Ming Emperor. The prohibition ended in 1644 with the coming of the Qing Dynasty, which encouraged smokers to mix in increasing amounts of opium. So there you go. You can see the Ming Dynasty, indigenous Chinese, they weren't too happy with tobacco smoking, and then the Manchu come in and they're happy with it. And they encouraged smokers to mix in increasing amounts of opium. In 1705, Wang Shihen wrote, "Nowadays, from nobility and gentlemen down to slaves and women, all are addicted to tobacco." Tobacco in that time was frequently mixed with other herbs, and opium was one component in the mix. So opium was just a tiny part of Chinese life at this time. Tobacco mixed with opium was called madak and became popular throughout China and its seafaring trade partners. Opium Prohibition began in 1729, when the Qing Emperor Yongzheng, disturbed by madak smoking at court and carrying out the government's role of upholding Confucian virtues, officially prohibited the sale of opium, except for a small amount for medicinal purposes. The ban punished sellers and opium den keepers, but not users of the drug. Opium was banned completely in 1799, and this prohibition continued until 1858. During the Qing Dynasty, China opened itself to foreign trade under what was called the Canton system through the port of Canton, modern Guangzhou, with traders from the East India Company visiting the port by the 1690s. Due to the growing British demand for tea and the Chinese emperor's lack of interest in British commodities other than silver. So basically, when traders would go to China to get tea, China porcelain, to get other herbs and spices that came from China, the only thing that the Chinese government was actually interested in was silver. British traders resorted to trade in opium as a high-value commodity for which China was not self-sufficient. The English traders had been purchasing small amounts of opium from China from trade since Ralph Fitch first visited in the mid-16th century. Trade in opium was standardised with production of balls of raw opium, 1.1 to 1.6 kilograms, 30% water content, wrapped in poppy leaves and petals, and shipped in chests of 60 to 65 kilograms, what was called one pickle. Chests of opium were sold in auctions in Calcutta with the understanding that the independent purchasers were then smuggled into China. Some competition came from the newly independent United States, which began to compete in Canton, selling Turkish opium in the 1820s. Portuguese traders also brought opium from the independent Malwa states of Western India, although by 1820 the British were able to restrict this trade by charging pass duty on the opium when it was forced to pass through Bombay. Despite drastic penalties and continued prohibition of opium, opium importation rose steadily from 200 chests per year to 1,000 to 4,000 to 30,000. The illegal sale of opium became one of the world's most valuable single commodity trades. Opium smuggling provided 15 to 20% of the British Empire's revenue and simultaneously caused scarcity of silver in China. So before the Opium Wars, China was regarded, modern research says that China was the biggest economy in the world. At the time, whether that was really understood, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether they really understood it. They certainly knew that there was a lot of wealth in China to be accessed. The First Opium War was really the first war fought over free trade. Britain wanted a trading relationship with China, and China was more than willing to sell things to Britain, but officially only for silver, unofficially for opium. And as it's already been said, even though opium was illegal, it was still eagerly sought after. In 1839, the Emperor Jiaogong rejected proposals to legalise and tax opium and appointed a viceroy, Lin Zhu, to solve the problem by abolishing the trade. Lin confiscated around 20,000 chests of opium without offering compensation. Now remember, the trade was about 30,000 chests. Blockaded trade and confined foreign merchants to their quarters, which means their quarter of the cities. The British government, although not officially denying China's right to control imports of the drug, objected to this unexpected seizure and used its naval and gunnery power to inflict a quick and decisive defeat, a tactic later referred to as Gunboat Diplomacy. China was very much behind Europe in its technology and in its thinking. This gives a good idea of just how behind China was. 19,000 Britons defeated 200,000 Chinese. British losses, killed and wounded, were about 500. Chinese, about 20,000. China suffered a humiliating defeat in the First Opium War, which was fought between 1839 and 1842, and it was forced to sign a series of treaties that have come to be called the Unequal Treaties. The Treaty of Nanking, the Supplementary Treaty of Bogue, and two French and American agreements were all regarded as unequal treaties signed between 1842 and 1844. So even though Britain fought the war, the French and the Americans also came in to get their share. The terms of these treaties undermined China's traditional mechanisms of foreign relations and methods of controlled trade. 5 ports were opened for trade, gunboats, and foreign residences: Canton, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. Hong Kong was taken by the British to become a free and open port, and China bequeathed the port in perpetuity, which means forever. Tariffs were abolished, just preventing the Chinese from raising future duties to protect domestic industries, and extraterritorial practices exempted Westerners from Chinese law. This made them subject to their own civil and criminal laws of their home country. So if you were a British subject and you were in China, you didn't have to obey Chinese laws, but you still had to obey British laws. And the same for the French and the same for the Americans. And in time, most European countries and Japan would have these extraterritorial rights. Most importantly, the opium problem was never addressed, and after the treaty was signed, opium addiction doubled. China was forced to pay 21 million silver taels as an indemnity, which was used to pay compensation for the traders' opium destroyed by Commissioner Ling. A couple of years after the treaties were signed, internal rebellion began to threaten foreign trade. Due to the Qing government's inability to control collection of taxes on imported goods, the British government convinced the Manchu court to allow Westerners to partake in government official affairs. By the 1850s, the Chinese Maritime Customs Service, one of the most important bureaucracies in the Manchu government, was partially staffed and managed by Westerners. In 1858, opium was legalised. In the 1880s, Britain reversed its policy on opium and helped to suppress both opium use and opium smuggling. And in 1907, it actually banned the importation of drugs, of opium. Commissioner Lin, often referred to in Chinese as Lin the Clear Sky for his moral probity, was made a scapegoat. He was blamed for ultimately failing to stem the tide of opium imports and usage, as well as for provoking an unwinnable war through his rigidity and lack of understanding of the changing world. And he really was a scapegoat because that was pretty much the whole of China. The whole of China was very rigid and lacked an understanding of the changing world. The opium trade faced intense enmity from the later British Prime Minister William Gladstone, who was one of Britain's great Prime Ministers in the 1800s. As a Member of Parliament, before he became Prime Minister, Gladstone called it most infamous and atrocious, referring to the opium trade between China and British India in particular. Gladstone was fiercely against the Opium Wars Britain waged in China in the First Opium War initiated in 1840 and the Second Opium War initiated in 1857. Now, the war started in 1839 and the second in 1856, but it wasn't until the final year, the next year, that the British government actually authorised the fighting of these wars because of the distances involved. He denounced British violence against the Chinese and was adamantly opposed to the British trade in opium to China. Gladstone lambasted it as Palmerston's Opium War, and Palmerston was the British Prime Minister, and said that he felt in dread of the judgments of God upon England for our national iniquity towards China. And he said that in May 1840. A famous speech was made by Gladstone in Parliament against the First Opium War. Gladstone criticised it as a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress to cover this country with permanent disgrace. His hostility to opium stemmed from the effects of opium brought upon his sister Helen. The failure of the treaty to satisfy British goals of improved trade and diplomatic relations led directly to the Second Opium War, 1856-60. In China, the First Opium War is considered as the beginning of modern Chinese history, which is why I've started with that. It is also the beginning of what in China has been called the Century of Humiliation. It is this century of humiliation that helps fuel modern China's attitude towards the West. And that's a very important thing for us to understand, that China feels that it has been very, very hard done by, and we did it to them. And there are those in China who would very much like to take their revenge, and other people who are a bit more moderate. But both of those are there. In 1850, a rebellion broke out in China called the Taiping Rebellion, and it lasted for 14 years. Some historians say that it was the deadliest war in human history. In other words, more people died in that war than in any other war. Others say it was the second, or third, or fourth most deadly war. And others say it wasn't really that bad. It might have killed a few million people or so. In other words, when things go bad in China, they go really bad. Now, most people died because of the breakdown of normal trade and government administration, which created famines and uncontrolled outbreaks of diseases. Although at the Third Battle of Nanking in 1864, right at the end of the war, more than 100,000 were killed in 3 days. So there was still a lot of fighting and killing that went on. Some of the shared goals of the Western powers were the expansion of their overseas markets and the establishment of new ports of call. The French Treaty of Hungpo and the American Wangsha Treaty both contained clauses allowing the renegotiation of the treaties after 12 years of being in effect. In an effort to expand their privileges in China, Britain demanded the Qing authorities renegotiate the Treaty of Nanking, which had been signed in 1842, citing their most favoured nation status. The British demands included opening all of China to British merchant companies, legalising the opium trade, exempting foreign imports from internal transit duties, suppression of piracy, and the regulation of the coolie trade. So coolies were labourers. In 1856, the Second Opium War broke out while the Taiping Rebellion continued. The war was as lopsided as the first had been. In June 1858, the first part of the war ended with the 4 treaties of Tencin, to which Britain, France, Russia and the United States were parties. These treaties opened 11 more ports to Western trade. The Chinese initially refused to ratify the treaties. The major points of the treaty were: Britain, France, Russia and the United States would have the right to establish diplomatic legations, which means embassies, in Peking. And Peking at that time was a closed city. Foreigners were not allowed. 10 more Chinese ports would be open to foreign trade. The right of all foreign vessels, including commercial ships, to navigate freely on the Yangtze River, which is one of the major rivers in China. The right of foreigners to travel in the internal regions of China, which had been formerly banned. And China was to pay an indemnity of 4 million taels of silver to Britain and 2 million to France. On the 28th of May, 1858, so just before the treaties of Tencin, a separate Treaty of Ogan was signed with Russia to revive the Chinese and Russian border as determined by the Nichiren Treaty in 1689. Russia gained the left bank of the Ama River, pushing the border south from the Stavago Mountains. A later treaty, the Convention of Tokyo in 1860, gave Russia control over a non-freezing area on the Pacific coast, where Russia founded the city of Vladivostok in 1860. Even though the treaties were signed, the war didn't end. More aggressive ministers were now advising the Chinese emperor, and they advised him to fight on. The British and French, with the support of one American warship going against its orders, would attack for the 3rd time the Taku forts. The first time they had been captured, but returned due to the treaty. The second attack failed, but the third did not. Once these forts were taken, then they could advance upon Peking, the imperial capital. While all this was going on, a diplomatic mission was sent to negotiate, but instead the Chinese took them prisoner, and some of them were killed, and some of them were tortured, and others were tortured and killed, although not all of them were harmed. When their bodies were found, the Europeans wanted revenge. When they reached the capital, they didn't enter the capital, but just outside there were what was called the summer palace, and the summer palaces were looted and burnt to the ground. And at this time, China signed the treaties. Now you will hear in China people still talking and still very bitter about the looting and burning of the summer palace, and a lot of artifacts in French and British museums, particularly in Paris and London, come from the looting of the summer palace. But from this point on, relations stabilised. China was opening up to trade, and Britain in particular wanted to stop the decline in Chinese power. It sent weapons and military officers to help the government suppress the Taiping rebellion. An effort was made to modernise China, to build factories, railways, and even supplying and training the Chinese army. But this wasn't done because it was in China's interest. It was done because it was in the Western interests. Now that they had obtained trade rights in China, they wanted to keep them. They didn't want a new government coming to power or a rebel government breaking away and having to renegotiate these treaties or possibly fight new wars. They'd got what they wanted and they wanted to keep it. So that now meant that China had to be kept as stable as possible. Now let's talk about the Unequal Treaties. This is a Chinese term, and it originates about 1915. But the truth is that before these Unequal Treaties, as we'll call them, were signed, China only did unequal treaties. China regarded itself as the great power, the centre of the world. China means the Middle Kingdom. And that means that everywhere else on the world is peripheral. It's unimportant. China is the important power. And that's how China treated everyone that it dealt with. And until the Opium Wars, that's how it treated the Western powers as well. And the two Opium Wars basically completely transformed that. And that's the real difference, is that now a treaty that China would have imposed upon somebody else was now being imposed upon them. And the interesting is, of course, today we'd think, well, why can't they treat each other as equals? But at that time, they did not. Neither China or the Western powers were interested in treating each other as equals. No one regarded the other as their equal. And unlike today, they didn't pretend. Right? They said that they were unequal, and they were very happy with that. They didn't have any problems at all. The winners of war was the great power, and the loser was not. And both sides agreed with that. And I guess in that way, they really were equal. Because opium was now legal, and opium was so wide, its use was so widespread, what began to happen was that the amount of poppies grown in China increased, and eventually it took over from the foreign trade. And one of the things that really helped the spread of opium was the ending of the Taiping rebellion. The economy came to depend on opium to play several roles. Merchants found the substance useful as a substitute for cash, as it was readily accepted in the interior provinces, such as Sichuan and Yunnan, while the drug weighed less than the equivalent amount of copper, which was the currency. Since poppies could be grown in almost any soil or weather, cultivation quickly spread. Local officials could then meet their tax quotas by relying on poppy growers even in areas where other crops had not recovered. Although the government continued to require suppression, local officials often merely went through the motions, both because of bribery and because they wanted to avoid antagonising local farmers who depended on this lucrative crop. One official complained that when people heard a government inspector was coming, they would merely pull up a few poppy stalks to spread by the side of the road to give the appearance of complying. A provincial governor observed that opium, once regarded as a poison, was now treated in the same way as tea or rice. By the 1880s, even governors who had initially suppressed opium smoking and poppy production now depended on opium taxes. So I think I'll leave it at that point, and then hopefully next week we'll take up with the story from 1900 and the Boxer Rebellion up until the creation of the People's Republic of China. If you would like to support the channel, you can by going to Subscribe Star, and have a good week. Bye-bye, everyone.